Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ian Pace, and I'm the convener of this debate and also a participant in it. I'd just like to thank you all for coming along to this, the first of a series of debates to celebrate 40 years of the music department at City University. And we're kicking off with what I think is going to be quite a sort of heated subject from various angles. So I'm not here to sort of be in charge. That role goes to Alex Lingus as the chair, so I'll hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you all for coming this evening to this debate on Are We All Ethnomusicologists Now? Rather than give a preface to this, because I think Ian has done so already, I think we should just dive straight in, and we will have the speakers, our guest speakers on the panel this evening, speak in alphabetical order, after which there will be time for one round of responses within the panel, and then we will open it up to the floor for further questions. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Amanda Bayley, who's Professor of Music at Bath Spa University. She is editor of the Cambridge Companion to Bartók on Recorded Music, Performance, Culture and Technology. In 2011, she contributed an article on ethnographic research into contemporary string quartet rehearsal to a special issue of Ethnomusicology Forum on the ethnomusicology of Western art music, edited by Laudan Nooshin to my right. Her research continues to focus on composer-performer collaborations, rehearsal analysis, and creative processes across cultural boundaries. Professor Bayley.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this debate. One factor that determines whether or not we are all ethnomusicologists now is what we identify as our starting point. So for the purpose of this debate, I'm going to take creative practice as a starting point and consider what this means in the 21st century. The composer-performer collaborations and more recent cross-cultural collaborations that have formed the topics of my research have necessitated a reconsideration of creative practice in terms of what that means to musicians in terms of composition, performance, improvisation, and memorization, and how that relates to history. Within Western traditions, my own research has shown how engaging with ethnographies of contemporary Western art music practice can reveal important musicological and ethnomusicological concepts through the study of what contemporary musicians and composers actually do. Thinking about what we teach as well as what we research, I found it useful for this debate to turn to Gavin Douglas's essay, Some Thoughts on Teaching Music History from an Ethnomusicological Perspective, from 2010. His opening sentence suggests that ethnomusicologists and musicologists should switch names. His argument that the disciplines are mislabeled is justified from the claim that, quote, ethnomusicology, often portrayed as the narrower, more obscure field, is undoubtedly the broader and more globally engaged. Musicology, by comparison, is quite narrow and specific, regionally and ethnically delineated. End quote. For those who need convincing that we are all ethnomusicologists, Douglas identifies textbooks that seek to bridge ethno and historical musicology by abandoning a geographical and linear historical approach in favour of a thematic approach that brings theory and comparison to the surface. He suggests this is an obvious model that could be adopted by music history with no damage to the canon and proposes that an alternative approach to the Western musical canon is through topics such as nationalism, social identity, religion, or dance. Or, he says, if a more sonically centred perspective is desired, then topics such as orchestration, vocal melisma, or heterophony could be chosen. And this is where I believe the value of musicology and analysis lies, within a broad concept of ethnomusicology. I suggest that if we start from a sonic-centred perspective, then we are starting from the idea of creative practice, which challenges an obsession with culturally constructed notions of masterpiece and genius. Many cultures across the world do not conceptualize music in terms of great works and do not differentiate between composer and performer. So it's time that more scholarly research reflects this. One recent example I've been studying is the practice of Ukrainian singer Marianna Sadowska, whom I have argued evokes a Bartokian spirit. Bela Bartok himself is, of course, an interesting person to consider in the context of this debate, as he has only been described as an ethnomusicologist retrospectively. When I was recently invited to speak at a Bartók symposium at the University of Leeds, I proposed that Sadowska meets the criteria that Daniel Biro and Martin Idun identify for what that spirit of Bartók would look like in the 21st century. Their criteria are being able to integrate elements of modern folk culture into her own compositional practice and vocabulary, seeking to make a synthesis of various traditions of East and West, North and South, and of the economically developed and developing world, and lastly, combining progressive elements of the Western art music tradition with integrated musical elements from oral traditions of the contemporary world. I don't have time to go into the details of Sadowska's music, but her collaboration with Christian Tomé on percussion and electronics creates a synthesis that extends beyond East and West to encompass old and new, traditional and contemporary ideas concerned with preservation and integration. In no way has Sadowska followed Bartók as a guide or a model, yet his spirit is manifest through her innovative way of sustaining a tradition. She inadvertently shares Bartók's goals of integration, in Biro's and Idun's words, assimilating the tradition until its tissue becomes almost indistinguishable from the contemporary compositional language that has enclosed it in a tight embrace. For my ethnographic research on Sadowska, in an interview in 2014, she described her music as a dialogue with tradition, which is illustrated in another way in her composition for voice and string quartet, Chernobyl the Harvest, written for the Kronos Quartet in 2013. In this pagan requiem, she uses the nuclear catastrophe of Chernobyl as a starting point to experiment with destruction and creation of musical structures and stories. It is based on ancient ceremonial music Sadowska collected from northern Ukraine. Like Bartók, she composes outwards from the peasant music rather than inwards from the European frame. Further examples I have studied revealed that memorization needs to be regarded as a parallel creative stimulus to notated composition from which multiple layers of creativity evolve. Whether reading from notation or playing from memory, just as performers of Western concert music go beyond the strict notation on the page, musicians at a Ukrainian wedding or funeral or an Afghan or Azeri classical music concert go beyond what has been memorized. What is interesting when musical traditions are combined is how musicians from different cultural backgrounds accommodate each other's needs along the creative path from memorization and/or composition to performance. In another study, characteristics arising from a cross-cultural collaboration between mbira, string quartet, and dance contribute towards an understanding of intercultural music making that is co-creative, built on collaborative composition rather than a hierarchical composer-performer relationship. Whether the context of music making is Western, non-Western, or intercultural, documenting, interpreting, and evaluating the views and accounts of musicians facilitates our understanding of music as social practice. In the increasingly globalized world we live in, an ethnographic approach helps to understand the precise nature of intercultural music making, or what Nicholas Cook describes as the relational conjunctions between one culture and another. Cook develops the idea of an intercultural musicology based on situated encounters, exploring what this might mean in terms of analysis and attempting to set it within the larger context of an emerging relational musicology. And those are his words. One way of grasping the nature of intercultural exchange is to build an evidence base from ethnographic research of fieldwork in relation to composition, in order to shed light on how the relationship between the traditional and the contemporary plays itself out. Intercultural analysis would reveal more about Sadowska's music and methods to show how ideas are transmitted and translated, understood and learned, and ultimately transformed through words and sounds. Such an analysis would include a performative vocabulary derived from the discourse and practice of collaborating musicians. From my ethnographic research route, I seem to reach a similar conclusion to Douglas, whom I quoted earlier. He arrives at a solution that necessarily points to a greater degree of interaction between ethnomusicology and music history. He states, quote, rather than geographically driven ethnomusicology courses and chronologically driven history courses, we could provide our students with the tools to investigate not only what music can teach us about other music, but what music can teach us about our world, thus paying more attention to the practice of music and lateral learning." End quote. As well as considering music across cultures and traditions, a lateral approach also forces music to be considered across genres and across disciplines. At a time when interdisciplinarity is increasingly encouraged, the lateral approach that ethnomusicology brings, through its focus on cultural values, systems, and social organisation, seems particularly helpful and to be promoted. Sophisticated music analytical approaches still have an important role to play in ethnomusicology, as illustrated, for example, in the work of Jonathan Stock, Simha Arom, and Kofi Agawu. My article in 2011 was an attempt to demonstrate the benefits of applying methods from ethnomusicology to contemporary string quartet rehearsal by examining interactive and collaborative processes that take place between composer and performers, in that instance Michael Finnessy and the Kreutzer Quartet. I still believe that the results of such studies can usefully contribute to a history of performance practice and to a pedagogy of performance, and more broadly, to a history of music. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bayley. We move on now to Tora Lind, who holds a position as Associate Professor within Ethnomusicology at the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies at the University of Copenhagen. He has done extensive field work among the monks of Mount Athos in northern Greece, studying the Greek Orthodox Christian chant tradition, also known as Byzantine music, a study where post-structural musical anthropology meets with musical paleography. Tora has also worked on heterodox healing practices with music and selected sounds of nature in the area of Copenhagen. He has written a non-ethnomusicological article on the blasphemy concept in the Pussy Riot case, and is interested in music torture, in historiographical issues, and Bakhtinian dialogism, to name a few. Most lately, Tora is hanging out, that is doing field work, in the metal scene in Denmark, experiencing various affective intensities among metal people in hardcore punk and black metal. So, Tora Lind.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me. Okay. I believe there is a very simple answer to the question, are we all ethnomusicologists now? And the simple answer is, in a sense, a clear no. All right then, let's go and have a beer. I say this, there's much more to it, of course. I say this not so much out of my own understanding of how various disciplines within music studies in fact converge. Ethnomusicology, musicology, music theory, popular music studies, and many others that relate less explicitly to music, but nonetheless are of great importance in how we think and write music studies. I say this simple no because I know colleagues who actively oppose ethnomusicology, who have a disbelief in fieldwork and in talking to people. I then ask my colleagues if they do not believe that we, in fact, work the same questions, and even though we come from different disciplines, our perspectives often look alike and have the same prefixes, such as a post-something, post-structuralism, post-whatever. And my colleagues answer that even though some theory or method might look the same, the approach and the material is different. So, I experience music scholars who actively oppose the idea that we are all ethnomusicologists. And this is, of course, a power issue played out between colleagues in a department, but also a question of who defines what music studies is and how. Or perhaps they just don't want to talk to me, or they only want to talk to me on their own terms, who knows. Their major claim is that there is no truth, whatever that is, to be found in ethnomusicology's meeting people, in talking to musicians, in interviewing audiences. People in the field say anything you'd like to hear. They may be wrong about this and that. They make stuff up to satisfy your desire for answers. They may reproduce an authoritative voice of the state, of an abbot at a monastery, who knows? They might just have, like an opinion of their own. So musicology is about opinions, and this leads me to the second part of what I want to say. Is truth really on the agenda here in doing ethnomusicology? How do any other music scholar make claims to truth, if they do? This is about what we want to know, I guess. If I want to know more about audiences in the metal scene, I believe that I actually get wiser going to shows, talking to fans. I'm well aware that one fan do not represent all fans, and one musician do not talk for everybody else. But what I get is a vague idea to begin with about what goes on in their minds, other than what goes on between us at a concert. And from such vague ideas, from fragments of shared experiences, a more fuller picture might develop. In my conversations with bearded monks in Greek Orthodox monasteries and bearded hardcore punk musicians in the Copenhagen metal scene, what I get are various positions within social spheres where practices are contested and negotiated discursively as well as in performance. How should I ever come to understand the different music performance practices at various monasteries in Greece at Mount Athos, despite claims to a unified musical orthopraxis, if I had not lived for a period together with the monks? How should I ever understand various positions in the hardcore milieu in Copenhagen between punk and metal if I did not begin to relate to people in that milieu? This is a major strength in ethnomusicology and why I love doing what I do. And this moves me to a third chapter, if you like, paragraph. So to move, you can see I'm moving away from a negative answer here and perhaps approaching a more affirmative answer. I begin to wonder what makes an ethnomusicologist. And I guess I have already suggested that it has to do with meeting people making music. Perhaps in other ways that other scholars do, I don't know. But that's what we're here to discuss. The conditions for field work can change, and they do change in many ways, also when it is ongoing. Our relations to people we meet in the field may change, and the terms we use when reflecting and thinking about our experiences, they may change as well. And I want to touch upon two points on these changes. Fieldwork changes as we build and strengthen relationships with those we work with in the field. For example, I had the experience of sitting backstage with a Danish black metal band for 45 minutes just talking, chatting, hanging out. And this was an hour or 2 hours before they had to play a live show. During the course of 8 months since my first interview with this band, I'm wearing the T-shirt. I'm complicit. I'm an accomplice here. I had finally understood how they were a kind of reluctant to give formal interviews. And they had finally understood that I do not really myself trust in formal interviews either. I rather want to just hang out and talk about music. And as this is what the musicians usually do, it made them a bit more relaxed and almost comfortable with my presence. This change of condition has an impact on the insight and knowledge to be gained from fieldwork, and it has an impact on how this insight and knowledge is generated. I am sure this experience is familiar to many of you, and you may go on to associate it with well-known discussions on insider-outsider dichotomies and so on and so forth. But even though the experience of breaking the ice when meeting people feels real enough, does that mean necessarily that there also is a cultural threshold to be crossed? I'm not so sure. So, this leads me to the second point I wanted to make on the change in fieldwork. Another way that conditions change is the way we think and reflect on fieldwork, on music history, etc. Challenging the idea of a cultural threshold to be crossed in fieldwork, Laura Edmondson draws renewed attention to the term complicity. Well, renewed and renewed. She does so in her 2007 book, Performance and Politics in Tanzania, where she quotes George Marcus, who wrote about it in 1989, for his use of complicity, suggesting an anthropological positioning, emphasizing rather than eliding cultural difference. If this means that there is a divide, it is because it is an actively contested boundary rather than a theoretical construct. That's what I gain from reading Edmondson. And I'm reaching my conclusion now. As a music scholar, I am an accomplice. I am guilty. Is that the right phrase in English? Complicity? Okay. I'm an accomplice in taking part in defining the boundaries along with all the others that I meet, audiences, musicians, etc. I'm an accomplice in constructing the musical realities that I communicate, in using the words that I do in my writing. I'm an accomplice in constructing the musical realities that, sorry, I just said that, I'm an accomplice, sorry, in many things. But this is not to say that what I write is false, or that any other ethnomusicology might write is false. It is merely to emphasize that musical knowledge is socially generated and that music studies is part of this world. Why else would we want it? As an ethnomusicologist, I'm not on the outside of this social world of music, if you like. I'm right in the middle of it, speaking from a changing, contingent, and often self-contradictory position. And if anything I have said is true, it is not only true for ethnomusicology. Thanks.
Our next speaker is Laudan Nooshin, who is a reader in the music department at City University London. She describes herself here as an ethnomusicologist, musicologist, Iranian music scholar in that order, and additionally affiliated to several other disciplinary areas. Though for putting Iranian music scholar last, you won a very nice award for your recent book on Iranian music. So maybe it should be, oh, okay.
Okay, hi everyone. Okay, so I should just start by saying that it feels very appropriate to be hosting this debate at City, given that Henry Stobart's 2008 edited volume in which Nick Cook's famous words first appeared in print is dedicated to the memory of Jerry Farrell, my predecessor here, who died in April 2003 and who some of you will remember, I'm sure. And Jerry also spoke at the November 2001 conference from which the book grew. So first things first, let's go back to that 2001 conference, at which Nick presented the original version of what became the 2008 book chapter. It's true that his paper was entitled We Are All Ethnomusicologists Now, referencing Nathan Glazer's book We Are All Multiculturalists Now, but in fact his final conclusion was not that at all. It was that we are all musicologists now. I was there and remember well the explosive response from the audience of mainly ethnomusicologists, and my subsequent report on the conference, also republished in the 2008 book, suggested reasons for it. When I asked Nick recently about the paper and his subsequent revisions, he said, that's the next one, I hope you can all see that. It ended by saying, it being his paper, it ended by saying, well, if we're all ethnomusicologists now, then there is no difference between musicology and ethnomusicology, so why don't we just say we're all musicologists now? However, when I came to write it up for Henry's book, I cut that. I decided it was open to interpretation as musicological hegemony and blunted rather than sharpened the main argument. I changed the title to We Are All with the brackets, Ethnomusicologists Now, at a late stage of book production, reflecting the brackets in the book's title. I begin with this anecdote partly to set the historical record straight. I'm fascinated by the politics of forgetting and by scholarly myth-making, what gets erased or rewritten and what stays in the collective memory. Of course, everyone remembers we are all ethnomusicologists now. And because it highlights questions of power and self-other binaries that have long underpinned the relationship between musicology, as normatively understood, and its other, ethnomusicology. And I should just say that my discussion here relates to the situation in the UK. Of course, disciplinary relationships play out quite differently in other parts of the world. So, Cook raises the question of musicological hegemony, and this seems a good place to start a discussion of disciplinary identities. For without it, and the self-other relationships that follow, this debate would be redundant. But when a narrow slice of music studies comes to occupy the disciplinary centre and claims the unmarked term, at the same time privileging a very culture-specific understanding of what music is, those excluded might justifiably invoke the idea of an occupied musicology. After all, when in 1885 Guido Adler set out his model for the scholarly study of music, with its two main branches of historical and empirical musicology, the latter included something also titled, actually, Alex, the next slide would be helpful here, sorry. This is from Guido Adler's 1885 article. And actually, if you click it again, the reference will come up. The latter, empirical musicology, also included something also titled musicology at the end there, but then in brackets, examination and comparison for ethnographic purposes, which of course became comparative musicology and later ethnomusicology. So we've got this occupied musicology, but there's a conundrum. If I seek to reclaim the unmarked term musicology in the name of a more holistic field studying music in its broadest sense, by which I mean not just a fetishist focus on music as sound or on other areas only relatively recently embraced by occupied musicology, such as performance or meaning, but music in all its diversity and beauty as physical movement, as behaviour, as ideas, something that people think and talk about and that plays a central role in and shapes their lives. If, like Cook, I declare that we are all musicologists, then I appear to deny a whole history of alterity by which ethnomusicology has long been defined. Being on the margins has attuned us to certain things and shaped the kinds of questions we ask, and arguably made us more receptive to ideas from a range of disciplines. Such a position also risks marginalising those who feel allegiances to other disciplines, such as history, anthropology, or area studies. But then, as I will argue in a moment, we don't just need to be one thing. So the first problem is that we can't have this conversation without using the inherited categories with their complex histories and baggage. If we were to start over, musicology might describe a more integrated field embracing any approach that enriches our understanding of music. And within that, musicology as is would be focused on one particular music culture, an ethnomusicology perhaps. But we are where we are. I've often wondered about other disciplines where an appropriated centre ground leads to such othering. I can't think of one. Do we have history and ethnohistory? So if we're not all musicologists, then perhaps we can all be ethnomusicologists. I would say the more the merrier. But first, presumably, we need to agree on what an ethnomusicologist is, and that, of course, is not easy, as evidenced by decades of debate. Is an ethnomusicologist defined by what they study or how they study it, by their approach or state of mind, or because they do ethnography? But then not all ethnomusicologists do. I, however, do ethnography, and for this debate thought it would be useful to put the central questions to some real people, mainly, but not only, ethnomusicologists. And I can see there's some in the audience here. I've anonymised everything, but you might be able to spot who the responses are for. So here's one response that reflects some of the complexities. We patently are not all ethnomusicologists now, because still none of us know exactly what that is. If it means doing anthropological style fieldwork, then very few of our Western art music colleagues do that kind of work, not even when they work on contemporary music. So no. If it means thinking about music in as cultural context, then WAM history colleagues have been doing that for a very long time anyway, especially the new cultural historians inspired by Clifford Geertz, etc. And let's be frank, that's not really what has ever distinguished ethnomusicology, so no. if it means recognising all the non-Western sounds and activities that ethnomusicologists study as legitimately music and worthy of study in music departments, then still no. There's still a lot of snobbery around. Disciplinary identities are strange things, and being an ethnomusicologist is about far more than what we study and how. It's about lineages and disciplinary canons, about spiritual homes, affiliations, and friendships built over years. Next quote. I'm an ethnomusicologist not because I study the non-West or culture or something. I'm an ethnomusicologist because I studied with Ruth Davis and Henry Stobart. I submit grants to do research that involves ethnography, and I think I should know the local language. I go to Buffy and SCM, and I hang out with Rachel Harris, Caroline Biffle, Laudan, Nooshin and co. I read Ethnomusicology Forum, and I have Shadows in the Field, Jennifer Post's book, and an old edition of Nettle on my bookshelf, alongside a ton of anthropology theory. Okay, next one. Thank you. As someone for whom contesting disciplinary boundaries has been something of a mission, I genuinely welcomed Cook's reminder in 2001 of just how much had changed since the late 80s. As Cook notes, with such convergence of interests, it does become increasingly difficult to distinguish between musicologist and ethnomusicologist in their scholarly work, and things are probably even more fluid now, judging from recent conferences where it has sometimes been impossible and unimportant to spot the difference. And I had a similar experience in editing the journal issue on the ethnomusicology of Western art music. You just sometimes couldn't tell the difference. At the same time, I find the idea that we might all be anything, or one thing, faintly alarming. We all have multiple identities, disciplinary and other. We're not just one thing, and we highlight different aspects of these identities according to time and place. As one participant explained, I call myself different things, ethnomusicologist, musicologist, music scholar, depending on the context, conference, teaching, country, fieldwork, and my audience, since these terms have very different meaning or little meaning to different people. Personally, the label is not so important to me. My research and teaching has been shaped by my ethnomusicological training, but my research in terms of methodologies and the literature I draw on is motivated more by the specific research questions I'm pursuing and less by subdisciplines they may be associated with. It also seems to me that this reification of the musicology-ethnomusicology binary potentially excludes others in the music studies constellation. Where in this discussion does one place music psychology, popular music studies, music education, or music informatics, for instance? I'm also mindful of the recent emergence or re-emergence of various brands of musicology, empirical, relational, radical, cultural, and so on, and wonder how these fit into the debate. So how much has changed in the last 15 years since Nick Cook first said those words? We weren't all ethnomusicologists then, and we certainly aren't now. But clearly, a growing number of self-identifying musicologists have been drawn to some of the issues, approaches, and methodologies largely associated with ethnomusicology, most obviously ethnography. Indeed, Cook's provocation might more accurately have been, we're all ethnographers now, or at least aspiring ethnographers. Some ethnomusicologists have expressed concern over what they see as ethnography light. As one put it, I don't see many musicologists producing fine-combed ethnographies or even doing extended, in-depth fieldwork. Personally, this concerns me less than what the trend heralds of a new attention to multiple voices and perspectives, which ethnography, in part, makes possible. Among those I spoke to, there was a surprisingly wide range of views, often coloured by experiences in the institutions where individuals work. Some felt that whilst the musicology-ethnomusicology boundary has blurred since 2001, I quote, I think there's actually very little engagement between the two, and scholars on both sides seem to have some rather stereotyped assumptions about the other. Many felt that institutional structures and internal politics worked against change. Indeed, my research revealed some quite shocking stories of exclusion and prejudice, including the idea that ethnomusicologists don't belong in a music department. Here, the politics of occupation and privileging of one ontology of music over others are clear. In contrast, there were many who felt that things had changed considerably, with the divide less significant now and with greater dialogue, evidence, for instance, in the number of conferences across subdisciplinary areas. Ethnomusicology is definitely less marginal, seen in the number of music departments hiring ethnomusicologists compared even with 10 years ago, and with ethnomusicology more central to the curriculum, including issues-based courses taught jointly by musicologists and ethnomusicologists. And this is significant at the very least for, quote, a new generation of scholars emerging for whom this is not an identity issue. Having studied a diversity of musics as undergraduates, unlike most of us, anyone here who went through the higher education system before the 1990s, it seems quite obvious and natural to draw on these different resources and methods. Some respondents suggested new terrains of convergence. For example, quote, I think there are two new convergences between A, musicologists and ethnomusicologists who are interested in how music mediates culture, and B, the new empiricists, big data, music and science, cognition, new music analysis, etc. And several others mentioned sound studies as an emerging area of shared interest. One of the difficulties in discussing the relationship between musicology and ethnomusicology is that there are still few who can speak authoritatively about trends in both. And there is thus a danger that we end up with a flattening of complexity and caricature-like statements such as the following. According to ethnomusicology, the cultures of the non-Western world should take intellectual precedence, and those of us who spend our time focusing on Western music should feel ashamed of ourselves. There is quite an irony in the fact that ethnomusicology, in the UK at least, increasingly attempts to colonise the Western music syllabuses of our universities. I don't recognise the ethnomusicology described here and would be interested to know what it is based on, given that many British ethnomusicologists, at least, come from a Western classical background and are still involved as performers of it. And the idea of ethnomusicology colonising Western music syllabuses is simply not borne out by the evidence and the institutional mechanisms which, until quite recently, kept ethnomusicology out of the power centre. I suppose it's in the nature of occupied territories to feel threatened by the idea of sharing space and more concerned with building walls and policing boundaries. A more charitable interpretation was suggested by someone who said that, in the current context of austerity cuts and closing departments, everyone is fighting for their own patch. Maybe, and in any case, I don't believe this to be a particularly typical view, but it is out there and in print. A rather different perspective was offered by someone who felt that the current climate made it all the more important to stick together. This is my last quote. I think that reflexivity over subdisciplinary boundaries or identities is worthwhile, but for it to spill over into animosity is a dangerous step in a climate in which serious thinking about music has little support outside academia. It's easy to find ways in which other people's scholarship on music doesn't measure up in some way to our own standards. Better would be to think more about how the best of musicology can enrich ethnomusicology and vice versa. This seems to me a good way of thinking about the future, and such healthy debates around the changing landscape of music studies will surely continue. Despite having its fingers in different disciplinary pies, British ethnomusicology is still most closely allied to musicology, and the vast majority of scholars are based in music departments. Whether these sister disciplines continue to travel alongside each other or develop a more conjoined relationship, I believe that ethnomusicology has much to learn from musicology, and scholars such as Amanda Bayley, Rachel Beckles-Wilson, David Clark, and others who've been drawn to ethnomusicology in different ways should be welcomed for their enriching presence and the new ideas and approaches that they bring. They are evidence that scholarly identity should be liberating, not confining. Thank you.
I'd like to now introduce my other colleague on the panel, Ian Pace, who has pursued a parallel career as both a pianist and a musicologist with particular focus on contemporary music. He has played in 22 countries, recorded over 20 CDs, and given over 150 world premieres. And he is lecturer in music and head of performance at City University.
Thank you, Alex. The very term ethnomusicology has obvious implications through the prefix ethno, which Nooshin and others have suggested as problematic. And despite its non-geographically specific origins, in terms of the Greek term, it didn't refer to any particular part of the world. Nonetheless, its long history of dealing with musical cultures outside of the Western art tradition, whether folk or vernacular traditions in the West or musical cultures, including so-called high cultures from the non-Western world, together with the contemporary resonances of terms like ethno or ethnic, suggests something post-colonial, anti-imperialist on the side of the wider masses and so on. Who of an even vaguely left-of-centre political persuasion would want to be seen opposing such a thing? But that is different when the object of study for the subdiscipline is itself Western art music, and it's on the body, or even I would say canon, of that type of work that I want to concentrate today. Hopefully you should all have a copy of the bibliography I prepared on this, because I'm referring to things there. I do believe it's always a cause for concern when any type of scholarship is judged more for its politics and its scholarly rigour, even if those are politics I agree with. And I think ethnomusicology of whatever type should not be immune from critique for purely political reasons. Now, the last thing I would want to do is deny the value of studying music from outside the Western art music tradition. On the contrary, I think is essential. In the context of my own work on Michael Finnessy, I've drawn extensively on ethnomusicological and folkloristic work, whether John Blacking on Bendan African music, Diego Carpitello and others on Sardinian folk music, Michael Hauser on Greenlandic music, Alexis Chotin on Moroccan and Berber music, and so on. And also on issues of Orientalism and exoticism in music, and looking for alternative perspectives to those provided by Said and later post-colonial theorists. Now, a few quick things. I don't think we should have to be over-apologetic about a certain Eurocentrism in music study taking place in Europe. Nor should that be the case anywhere else in the world for their centrism. Nor should we, I think, apologise for the fact of being drawn to various types of music from very different social contexts, primarily as a result of an attraction to the sounds they make, rather than necessarily from a wish to study those contexts. On the other hand, I would never want to deny the vital importance of studying the social and political context of music making. 10 years or so ago, I got into an awful lot of fights with some conservative musicians saying it was wrong to bring politics into music. And all my own teaching research involves a great deal of wider history, society, ideology, economics, the workings of institutions, and so on. But today I am deeply concerned not about the incorporation of plurality of approaches to music, but the potential for subsumation of musicology into other disciplines to such an extent that it loses any distinct identity of its own. So, if you look at the bibliography, I'm not claiming this as comprehensive in terms of ethnomusicology of Western art music. I've left out studies of performance and reception of Western art music outside of the Western world, so not the work of, say, Rachel Speckles-Wilson or Ben Etherington or Jeff Baker. And also I haven't looked at work on the role of Asian musics and music in Western traditions. And there are 3 texts of these studies that time has not permitted to read or not been able to obtain, those of Livingston, Chaikin, and the full dissertation by Usner, so I'll not refer to those. Of this list, I particularly want to separate out from my critique the excellent book by Chanan, which is really of quite different nature and is more of a social and economic history of music in a long tradition. And also I think the work of Peter Jeffrey is very different in terms of the depth and expertise that it brings to bear. So many have commented that defining ethnomusicology as a subdiscipline can prove elusive. But we still have scholars who self-identify as ethnomusicologists and others who do not. Now, despite what Laudan says about ethnomusicology not being marginal, there are still very few undergraduate degrees specifically in ethnomusicology, or at least labelled as such. And as such, most ethnomusicologists work in departments on degree programs simply identified as music or musicology. And while many popular music or music technology programs can have dedicated degrees, which are sort of staffed and taught almost exclusively in terms of the specifics of those areas, usually ethnomusicologists work in those departments focused on Western music, history analysis, and so on. And that can cause a good deal of tension. Now, much of the literature I'm considering, and also for that matter in much of the so-called new musicology, the writers spend a lot of time maligning Western art music and so-called traditional musicology, not always from a position of any detailed knowledge of either field. I find strawman characterizations are frequent, as in the work of Kingsbury, Nettle, Cottrell, or Maizala. At the same time, I've seen no other subdiscipline so jealously defensive and keen to assert its own superiority, nor which spends so much time talking about itself in a somewhat cliquish manner, endlessly telling its own story and creating its own canon of hallowed figures, as, for example, with Kay Kaufman-Shellemey's recounting of the figures behind the great milestones of ethnomusicology, Alan Merriam, Alan Lomax, Timothy Rice, Mark Slabin, and then equally revered sources from outside musicology such as Clifford Geertz or Apadurai. Almost all the writers on ethnomusicology of Western art music cites most of the others before them, especially the work of Kingsbury, Bowman, Finnegan, and Nettle, thus locating themselves within a newly constructed great tradition, and internal critique is rare. It sometimes appears as if the simple fact of having employed what is identified in the ethnomusical approach to the study of Western art music is enough to win any writer a seat at the top table, and this overrides any more sober critical investigation of their work. And that is the attitude I find in Shalamai, Stock, Cottrell, Ramnarine, Maisala, Nooshin, and some others. As such, in a relatively self-regulating world, through the process of peer review, external examination, and so on, what I believe to be some very serious flaws are almost entirely overlooked, or at least a lot of the time that's the case. And I think this speaks to something more territorial rather than consideration of scholarship. Can I have the next slide? These are two quotes from John Blacking and Henry Kingsbury about denying the idea that music needs to be studied on so-called on its own terms. I agree with them. That's the case. But I have heard that one needs to judge ethnomusicology on its own terms. But I think what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I don't identify as an ethnomusicologist, but I've read a reasonable amount. If I'm unqualified to have a view, then by the same token, many ethnomusicologists would be disqualified about speaking about other musical disciplinary areas or fields about practice, about which they often do not hesitate to pronounce. The study of music in a wider social context is nothing really like as new as sometimes suggested. Even Nick Cook, in the article that inspired this discussion, conceded this when mentioning traditions from musicological traditions outside the English-speaking world. But it can take various forms. In fact, have the next slide. Here's a quote from Bruno Nettel from his book Heartland Excursions. A major theme of ethnomusicological discourse is that fundamental values of a culture expressed in its music. You could also, I think, substitute the word society for culture to give it a more sociological rather than anthropological feel. If applied in a general manner, I think that statement can be reductive and limiting. In its most fundamentalist manifestation, and I do recognise this is not true of all ethnomusicological work, it resembles what was once called a vulgar form of Marxism, by which all elements of societal superstructure are nothing more than a byproduct of the economic base, a view that was rejected strongly by Friedrich Engels in some late letters, and I think you can show that Marx himself rejected it too. So in place of that, the formation which has informed a lot of Western Marxism over the 20th century is a more dialectical relationship between base and superstructure, and I'm counting culture and music as part of the superstructure here. And I would argue very strongly for a similar model for music in culture, music in society. I don't believe there are many contexts which one can use to account for every single detail of the music emerging from therein, though I'll concede there may be a few. And so that creates degrees of relative autonomy. And in some societies, not least advanced industrial ones, is there not an important place for some dissident culture which wishes to confront that society? In contrast to that, the reductive view I describe, I think, ultimately leads to the politics of Zdanov. And I think hostility towards considerations of the possibility of degrees of autonomy leads in that direction. Now, Nettel also writes about how the ethnomusicologist should try to avoid doing anything to affect the culture being studied. Now, over and above the question of whether this is indeed possible, I wonder why it should always be paramount. Marx famously said in the thesis on Feuerbach that philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. The same might be said of some anthropologists and ethnomusicologists. But how much of the work is done by, say, education reformers with positive proposals for meaningful change, rather than those embroiled at the heart of academic systems seeking academic capital through the allegiances and ideologies of their work? Walter Benjamin argued that there's no record of culture which is not also a record of barbarism. And even if that's hyperbolic, there are plenty of cases which it's true. Instead of fetishizing cultures, which I do believe there are tendencies in anthropology and ethnomusicology to do, fetishizing them just by the fact that they're labeled cultures, I think we might do better to look for those aspects of cultures which are still worth valuing in contemporary contexts. Now, there's much ethnomusicological work which does not consider the relationship between sounds and context, but brackets sounding music out entirely. Without detailed awareness and consideration of the specifics of musical material, I believe it's impossible to gauge the very possibility of a dialectical relationship between sounds and context, and I believe that's one reason why many writers do not do so. What remains is what I call, at my harshest, musicology without ears. Musicology which requires little in terms of any type of traditional musical skills in whatever tradition, And the more that can achieve a dominant or hegemonic place within contemporary musical education, the more it can contribute to the de-skilling of a profession, so that musicology can become little more than a rather elementary subsection of sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, but rarely with the breadth or depth of methodological awareness to be found in some of those other disciplines. And that can also then facilitate the possibility that university managements can close musical departments or simply incorporate them into others. And that's why I think certain forms of de-skilled musicology might actually be better housed in other disciplines. I have the next slide. I'm not going to read this. I hope you can read it. This is an interesting quote about ethnography by the anthropologist Tim Ingold. Now, I don't deny the value of ethnographic approaches, but I have some doubts about their exclusive or simply primary use, especially when this entails an ideological opposition to the employment of other methods. It is as if it's more important to maintain a territorial purity than draw upon the widest range of possible strategies to help with producing the result. So in the work of Kingsbury and Nettle, and to some extent Cottrell, I think you encounter very crude historical analytical approaches. Kingsbury looks at one passage where a teacher was talking about using the pedal in the second movement of Beethoven's C minor piano concerto, but he takes no account of the type of instrument involved, which could profoundly affect the sounding result. And he also seems to imagine it's impossible to execute opposing dynamics in two hands on the piano. He gives comments on Marcus Goldman's thoughts on Chopin editions without awareness of the real complications entailed there, as Chopin published most of his works simultaneously in 3 countries in different versions. I think he's rather dead set upon setting up a clear dichotomy between fidelity to a text and some nebulous notion of what is expressive, with the latter defined with minimal thought to the historically problematic nature of such a category. Next slide. Now, in the case of Kay Shellemeyer's article on the Boston early music movement, which I'm afraid I think is one of the weakest articles I've read, here are some of the findings which you can look at. I'd have to say to anyone with even a degree of familiarity with this world, this is really extremely basic. And I say that of some other work, like that of Seddon and Biasuti. And some engagement with what's a very developed range of discourse on historical performance could change this considerably. Ruth Finnegan admits reasonably that she doesn't feel qualified to engage with music she encounters, but I do think this does limit her survey quite considerably, and it often turns out to be more like a list of data than critical analysis. Catherine Cameron tries to define experimental music, but with no evidence of familiarity either of later traditions to which this term has been applied, the history of the term, or perhaps significantly of music created in Europe at the same time as that she studies. And as such, I do not believe she's really in a position to argue for American experimental music as a separate category from European traditions, in the manner she does. So, as I said about work that doesn't engage with sound, and that includes a lot of this work of Herndon, Finnegan, Bourne, Brennan, Shellemeyer, Cottrell, Pitts, Seddon, Biasuti, Usner, Malcolmson. Often, instead, there are comments from others about music, frequently of a rather vague and general nature, without much consideration of what self-fashioning might be involved. In one case, there's even a xenophobic comment from a musician about making the Hitler salute at a conductor who rehearsed in German, without further comment. If there were no attempts to draw conclusions in this work about sounding music, this might not be so bad, as was Finnegan say, but some do. But even with the more modest aims, I do think there are flaws. It's almost like assessing a performance or piece simply by asking the performer or composer their view of it and reproducing that, which is indeed what Maisala does with Kaya Sariaho. When I was teaching at Darlington College, I sometimes found students would undertake a project simply by asking their friends a handful of questions and using their answers as data for a supposedly scholarly and statistically representative survey. Now, I do sometimes feel some ethnography does the same sort of thing on a slightly bigger scale, not least because of a lack of critical and analytical perspective on the data sourced. There's an understandable post-colonial reticence on the part of many Western ethnomusicologists and anthropologists for engaging in critical views of non-Western societies and cultures they encounter. But when this attitude is carried over into the study of Western art music, and text is padded out with long ethnographically sourced quotations, often from those who are not particularly verbally articulate, without commentary, critique, analysis, one could be left with a type of writing which resembles nothing so much as casual journalism or even a publicist's material. There's a place for this, but is it high-level scholarship? In many classic ethnographies, the collation and presentation of ethnographically sourced data, especially quotations, is a starting point for the study, leading to detailed critical analysis. but some of this work I'm looking at basically omits the second stage or renders it trivial. Now, I'd not claim that description is a neutral activity, and I do think it can be undertaken with great care and skill, but in many cases I feel it amounts to more like reportage. Or say, Finnegan's long book does read rather like a government inspector's report, or that of Pitt's resembles feedback surveys conducted by marketing departments for musical institutions, whereas Moisala to me reads like a hagiographic publicity piece, oddly very much like an earlier type of Life and Works. But there is another approach, which is very agenda-driven, in which most phenomena are described in extremely loaded language. A term like occupied musicology I would put into that category. It's true, I think, of the work of Small, Kingsbury, Nettleborn, Malcolmson. It's hard to imagine work with such a strong extra grime being viewed so favourably if applied to a group of South Sea Islanders, as Björn Heiler has pointed out in the context of Born. Ethnography relies upon the investment of a good deal of faith on the part of the reader that the author has represented their source material in a fair manner, not distorting, misattributing, quoting radically out of context, fabricating, or blatantly ignoring substantial amounts of data which might not suit an argument. Where there are documentary sources available, these can at least be checked by another where there's room for doubt. But there is some of this work I look at where I'm not sure I'm prepared to invest that faith. Now, I had some stuff relating to Torah's work, but I think I might skip that for now, but I can come back to it later in the discussion if we want, because this was interesting stuff about oral tradition and problems about, how on one hand, there's a lot of critique of the people who say, I studied with X, who studied with Y, studied with Z, so on, studied with Beethoven, coming from some of the very same people who, on the other hand, claim that they can tap into some oral tradition that survived over centuries without seeing the irony there. I want to say just a few other quick things. One, I'll keep it quick, is about, we can move on slides-wise, is about the use of jargon. And Kingsbury himself notes how any study of modern American culture is, quote, lent an anthropological aura by using terminology like shamans, big men, warlords. Now, I feel a lot of the phenomena which are given ritualistic explanations in, say, the work of Small, Kingsbury, Herndon, or Nettle, can actually be explained in practical terms. The fact of not having doors opening directly into a concert hall can simply be a way of avoiding extraneous noise generated by latecomers. Or when Kingsbury says that students contrast administrative weaknesses of an institution with the strengths of teachers, they conceal the fact that these factors are elements of a single organisational structure. Well, in my time at the Juilliard School, the staff on the second floor there couldn't care less about practical student matters for which they were responsible, and they sometimes acted as we were trespassing on their time and space we went in. I can't see how asking them to buck their ideas that would have undermined the artistry of the faculty members, which would seem to be the conclusion from Kingsbury. But in line with the critique from Ingold before, I think a lot of writers are more concerned to force far-fetched analogies with other anthropological findings than to investigate the specifics relating to the matter under investigation. And this is part of a wider tendency to clothe work in a good deal of jargon in ways I believe to be unnecessary. Then, if some earlier writers like Goulet, Chanan, to some extent Nettle, and outside of ethnomusicology, Howard Becker, come from slightly older traditions in the social sciences, which still show the influence of Marxism, albeit usually of the empirical and Stalinist variety dominant in the English-speaking world. Many of the younger figures demonstrate to me clearly the influence of ideologies frequently identified as postmodern, which I associate strongly with the growth of neoliberalism during the Thatcher-Reagan years and then after the end of the Cold War. This is most explicit in the work of Bourne, who has expressed a clear view in print of the superior virtues of culture supported by petty capitalism, her term, than by institutions supported by the state, which I would categorize as democratically accountable institutions financed through taxation and public spending. I'd say that view accords perfectly with David Cameron's ideal of the big society and is quite music to the ears of those who would want to cut arts funding generated through taxation. One might conclude from an EARCAM study that the remoteness of the possibility that a UK or US government might ever give financial backing to similar institution should presumably be welcomed. And in general, in a lot of this work, the musical institutions are viewed very critically, but it is rare that industries, in many cases institutions funded by private capital rather than through taxation, as with much of the popular music industry, are subject to the same level of critique. This is emblematic of a wider ideological phenomenon which some radical thinkers, including critics of cultural studies such as Todd Jutlin, Robert McChesney, Keith Tester or Joseph Heath, or anti-capitalist thinkers like Naomi Klein have identified, whereby a superficial politics of diversity is not so much a moderate call for a modification of capitalist society, but actually a means of giving new life and purpose to high capitalism, not least through the destruction rather than reform of existing social democratic institutions. And there are various ways I think you can find similar ideologies in the work of Nicholas Cook, which I won't go into now, other than to mention his rejection in line with various ethnomusicologists of aesthetic valorization and using that to direct study. He says that musicologists should instead, like sociologists, quote, study social reality as they find it, so that the point is not that Madonna is good or bad, but that she's there. But to bracket out or otherwise marginalize anything which is not there, assuming there to mean something that's achieved a degree of prominence, for otherwise everything is there, renders invisible that cultural work whose producers have been unable to gain public visibility. Only a belief that a market will always provide the most fair selection could legitimize musicologists and others neglecting all else. In place of aesthetic judgment, in both new musicology and some ethnomusicology, I encounter politically and morally loaded characterizations which I believe serve principally to attempt to close down debate. And I find it sad when musicology has moved from a position of intense interest in music to morally self-righteous judgment. There are various moral grounds for which some will condemn the ethnomusicological work and ideologies of Bartók, or some of the work upon which Finnissy draws. But to me, the value of that work is palpable because of the vital creative composition which would not have been possible in the same way without it. The same is true of some of the amazing work that has come out of IRCAM, like that of Boulez, Berrio, Apagis, Harvey, Sariaho, Maneri, Dillon, Nunes, and others. And ultimately, I do believe that the importance of compositional work and its performance in whatever tradition exceeds that of any type of musicology. So I'll end with a re-application of Marcel Mauss to the field of ethnomusicology itself, in a slightly satirical way. Its participants offer up endorsements for the right theorists, the right canonized and revered ethnomusicologists, the right political outlook, and generally that sort of what I call consumerist multiculturalism, which accords well with modern neoliberalism, to those who are in a position of power above them, and are rewarded for this through promotion and research grants in a process of reciprocal exchange. Collegiate relationships within hierarchical academic structures are made possible through this process of reciprocity. This may be an unfair caricature, but no more so than some of the analyses in the body of work I've looked at. Thank you.
And then we come to our last speaker on the panel. That's Michael Spitzer, who is Professor of Music and Head of School at the University of Liverpool. He leads his department's work on classical music, music theorist and musicologist. He is an authority on Beethoven with interests in aesthetics and critical theory, cognitive metaphor, and music and affect. Professor Spitzer.
Thank you. I'd like to pull out three strands from Nicholas Cook's rich and thought-provoking article, a thought piece I mostly agree with, except to suggest that Cook may have been too optimistic. What I mean by too optimistic I'll get to after I try to clarify these three strands. The first point to make is that the term ethnomusicology ought to be distinguished from ethnography, and we see ethnographic methods usefully applied to all walks of scholarship in Western music, including music in everyday life and music psychology. And by contrast, and this claim doesn't seem to be wildly out of line with the programs of recent British forums of ethnomusicology conferences, ethnomusicology seems to throw its focus on world music. The second point is that the analogy with historical musicology is limited. To be sure, the past is another country and all that, but ethnographic research requires living respondents, and the people in the distant past are dead. The notion of hermeneutic alterity is a fudge in this respect. I began my career as a Beethoven sketch scholar, and Beethoven isn't around to explain his shocking handwriting, nor his choice of inks or the watermarks on his paper. Paleography, like forensic pathology, is the art of the silent witness. It's also a highly technical discipline, and in an economy of time scarcity, every hour the medievalist or sketch scholar puts into reading Lacan or Bourdieu is 1 hour less to perfect their specialist craft. My third and final point is that the performative turn isn't necessarily the best bridge between the two disciplines, or rather, performativity isn't the same thing as performance tout court. All scores address the implied performer, do they not? And the Kantians taught us that listening is a kind of internal, imaginative performance as we mentally track the dynamics and intentions of the music. The Dutch theorist Michael Schaer wrote provocatively that his experience teaching at the Amsterdam Conservatoire suggests that analysts can sometimes be more creatively performative than pianists who mechanically or unthinkingly reproduce the music. All of which points to the so-called problem of the musical score being in fact a red herring. One field not mentioned in Cook's article is popular music analysis, since it came of age fairly recently. A common starting point for analysing popular song is that there often is no score, or rather the analyst works with a transcription they have made themselves. And yet the music itself is no less an object for reflection for the lack of an original score. It is a sonic conceptualization. I am aware that a notion of the music itself is hugely overdetermined, and in defense I can point to Brian Kane's recent book, Sound Unseen, which mounts an impressive recuperation of the musical object on Husserlian transcendental grounds, indebted to Pierre Schaeffer's typology of hearing types, as well as to Jean-Luc Nancy's philosophy of listening. And it is this which brings me back to my opening claim that Cook was too optimistic. Why? Cook's ideal is laudable in principle, but in practice it hits the rocks of academic politics. And in short, it is not a two-way street. On the one side of the street, musicology has been attacked for a generation for its apparently inadequate social and cultural mediations, and it has got its house in order. On the other side, I'm not aware of many bullets shooting in the opposite direction, and yet the sniping against musicology continues. Let me give two examples, one general and the other more personal. In 2013, Liverpool My University held an international conference on analysing popular music. The world's main forum for popular music scholarship is IASPM, yet many of the renowned visitors to our conference told me how difficult it is for them to get a friendly hearing at IASPM, an organisation much more oriented towards ethnographic approaches. My personal example is a polemic aimed at me by David Hesmondhalgh in his recent book, Why Music Matters, where he accuses me of formalism in my forays into analysing musical emotion. I answer Hesmondhalgh in an article coming out soon in the journal Popular Music. All I will say here is that I hit the ball back over the net and ask him, what is so wrong with formalism? Don't songs have form? Isn't it useful, even enjoyable, to explore how an artist or composer crafts and finesses musical materials? And more bluntly, how much do the critics of musical analysis really understand what it involves? So, in sum, I would set the disciplinary boundaries elsewhere. There are fine ethnomusicologists who effortlessly absorb and deploy analytical methods. Simon Mills on rhythm in Korean folk music, Chloe Zade on schemata in Indian classical improvisation, not to mention more senior figures such as Michael Tenser, Richard Widdis, or Martin Clayton. Equally, most, if not all, Western musicologists are socially and culturally aware, whilst upholding the values of abstraction and, let us say it, formalism. Rather, the real difference is to borrow categories from game theory between zero-sum games and positive-sum games. In a zero-sum game, one side needs to lose for the other side to gain. In a positive-sum game, both sides win. And certainly my experience of musicologists or music theorists is that they are happy to live and let live. But perhaps this is not always the case for ethnomusicologists or social scientists in their attitude towards musicologists. Equally, I think there are differences, notwithstanding the absorption of music analysis and ethnography by both sides. And you see that in our conference programs. The spread of repertories in an ethno-conference is extremely diverse, whereas most delegates at the RMA meeting will know their Schubert or Debussy. In musicology, this experience of commonality is an invaluable basis for intersubjective discussion and methodological progress. Stepping gingerly and at the risk of simplification, I suggest that the pattern of consensus in an ethno meeting is reversed. People may agree more on theory and method, the repertories tending to be mutually unfamiliar. And that is perfectly fine. It is a difference worth preserving, as its dynamic will help keep music studies as a whole moving and developing. But to repeat, this will only happen if both sides respect each other in a live and let live culture. And at the moment, I see this respect as rather one-sided. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Spitzer. Well, gone through quite a number of themes thus far, and certainly a lot of common ground, at least in terms of some of the basic issues, even if we don't necessarily all have the same vantage point. It's just struck right now with comparing what you just said to what Tora Lind had said, where it seems that maybe the bullets are flying in different directions in Copenhagen, at least. So what I'd like to do now is then, why don't we just go in order of maybe of people being seated here. So maybe we'll start with you, Laudan, and then just in terms of if anyone has any comments on what other members of the panel have said before I open it up to the floor. Or do you want to? Shall we do that?
Yes, I'm not sure actually. I've got quite a few ideas down here. I'm just wondering maybe about opening it up to the floor sooner rather than later, but if there's other
I think it's fair to have the panelists allow it their chance
okay,
to respond.
well,
any sort of burning issues right now.
I mean, maybe we can pick this up when it goes to the floor, but I'm quite surprised, I guess, about this idea, the kind of which direction the bullets are flying in, because I'm quite unaware of examples of ethnomusicologists being disrespectful, as it were, to musicologists, or maybe it's happening. I mean, obviously, I showed a very clear example of the other direction in my talk, but perhaps that's something we can pick up on. Kind of following on from that, I guess one of the things I thought about, one of the points that Ian made, by the way, Ruth Finnegan isn't an ethnomusicologist, I'll just make that point. That when you say that it works both ways, and if ethnomusicologists can have a view on Western art music, then it should work the other way around. Of course, the difference is that the majority of ethnomusicologists, at least in the UK, do come from a Western classical music background. So I did a purely Western art music undergraduate degree, which does, that makes a bit of a difference, I think.
Not necessarily from background in the other fields of musicology, which are often
not necessarily, but I think that might be a difference. Anyway, I don't have anything to add at this stage.
Amanda.
It's hard to know what to pick on, really, what to pick up on, except I suppose I was reminded of, going back to Merriam's, the idea of sound, behaviour and culture being so central. It seems as across musicology and ethnomusicology in a way, but I'm not sure how that helps to...
One theme that comes up is music, a central term. Ian, you were talking about some dangers when the music is taken out of musicology. And I was, for a moment there, I was wondering, what do you actually mean by the music? As I know, as sound. Yes, I understood that later. Okay. All right, but how would you? That's tricky to me. I know sound, timbre, the way that ideas are put to music, or the ways that music might develop ideas about culture, society, life in general, whatever, or reflect upon them in various ways. But I wonder how sound could be extracted or taken out of any context or any situated or any situation where it is performed or listened to or read or whatever. I wonder if you...
Well, I certainly think it shouldn't be, but I think quite a bit of the work I'm looking at doesn't deal with the sound at all.
Out of curiosity, don't I deal with sound?
Oh no, your work certainly does.
Okay.
But that's not in... No, absolutely it does, and so does Amanda's and so does Laudan's work. Well, something like Stephanie Pitt's work certainly doesn't look at that. Nor does Ruth Finnegan's. I know she's not an ethnomusicologist, but she's very heavily cited in this body of work. Henry Kingsbury, only in passing. Catherine Cameron, which is work I've looked at a lot in other contexts in writing about experimental music, not at all. And I think the work is very deeply flawed, because she's trying to define something called experimental music without any evidence that she ever listened to any of it, or listened to any other music that was roughly contemporary, so as to be able to establish whether there are reasons it can be categorized differently. And if such a categorization has nothing whatsoever to do with what it sounds like, I don't think it's worth very much.
I think the question of boundary doesn't interest me so much as the necessity of preserving a skill set, a varied and diverse skill set, which includes ethnography and analysis, and also a comfort with abstraction. It's not to say that music is always deracinated or can be uprooted. It's that abstraction is a moment and on a spectrum of different listening types. There are different ways of listening. It's what Pierre Schaeffer calls reduced listening. It's listening for the musical sources, acoustic properties in themselves, and that's a perfectly valid way of engaging with music, just as are the other modes of listening to sounds as an index of a cultural trace. But it seems to me that a lot of the discussion wants to reduce the options to just one or the other. It is the zero-sum game. I think I'm much more invested in a positive-sum game where we view every skill as just one thing we can learn to have a richer common experience.
Isn't that why we should be upholding the work of scholars such as Jonathan Stock, Simha Arom and Kofi Agaru as examples of who have brought in musicological analytical techniques in an ethnomusicology context?
Yes, absolutely.
So,
yes.
I hear countless times of, just like that, the people that we must be celebrating are all ones that in some sense identified as ethnomusicologists. I've so rarely ever heard people who identified that field talking about how they might learn something from the other direction. And I've heard many people who don't identify agreeing with the idea that there's lots to be learned from ethnomusicology, and I would agree with that. It seems very one way, the way that Michael was describing. And that worries me. I think this is why I think it's a politically loaded thing that sort of leads to, well, not so much a zero-sum game, but a type of debate where the stakes have such obvious political implications that few are prepared to question them. And I don't think that's healthy in the scholarly climate at all. And together with Michael, I do very much wonder about this disdain for abstraction, this disdain that you sometimes find for analysis, and for formalism, which, once again, I say that, to me, ultimately takes you back to the Zdanov decrees of the 1940s.
Just maybe one other a follow-up before we open things up to the floor. I mean, what I've been hearing is a kind of dichotomy, though, between the disciplinary boundaries and the whole issue of academic politics on the one hand, a kind of tribalism, where we're worried about zero-sum games because if the other person wins, I lose, versus what people actually do in many cases, because at the same time we've had so many mentions of particular individuals, Michael Tenzer, Kofi Agawu, others, who absolutely acknowledge their debt to whoever they happen to be drawing from, and all sorts of methodologies. So I'm wondering if to the extent, maybe have this as a first question and open up to the floor, to which you think that there are things that we could do to get beyond this zero-sum game approach. What positive steps might be taken? Anyone?
I think, to follow Ian's provocation, to be a little bit less self-reflexive and just more pragmatic about learning skills, as many skills as possible.
I could go with that.
Another way might be to engage in music, in musical cultures or various sources, and present that work in different on different conferences for a different another audience than the one that we usually. I don't know if you do if that's what you are doing. Ethnomusicologists going to BFE and SEM and talk, or also talk in other groups, to other.
I mean, it has to be said that there's a lot of connections being made. The RMA and Buffy recently had a joint research students conference, and that's going to be a regular thing now. I'm on the RMA council. I mean, there are a lot of people crossing these boundaries, so I don't see it as territorial as some people seem to, but then maybe we just come with our different perspectives. I don't know.
But I suppose there's a point to be made about kind of getting out of your particular tribal group, and what one of your Laudan, one of your respondents, had mentioned, just they didn't know how to categorize themselves, because depending on which group they went to address, and I think that also responds very well to your what you said, Michael, about the question about the various skill sets ranging from paleography to whatever it is it takes, whatever it takes to do what you need to do. My own experience has been sometimes I'm a Byzantinist, sometimes I'm a liturgical theologian, sometimes I'm a medievalist, sometimes I'm an ethnomusicologist, depends which group of people I'm actually talking to, and I know that's true of your work as well, Tora, just because of the skill set you had to learn to do your work on the monks of Mount Athos. Why don't we then open this up to the floor? Please identify yourself. We are filming. If you don't want to be filmed for some reason, please let our cameramen know after the fact. But since it is being filmed, please announce who you are and then to whom your question is directed, whether to the entire panel or a specific member, please.
Mention the idea that we should be sort of Eurocentric because we are in Europe, and we should focus on Western.
That's not quite how I put it.
European.
It's not quite how I put it. I'd say we shouldn't worry too much that there is a degree of centrality of European music of all types, not just classical.
All types of music.
Well, music from the region we're in.
Music from the area we're in, fine, but the reality is that
I think that's absolute nonsense. No, I think that's absolute nonsense. And I think if you go to a lot of institutions in this country where you'll even find people in the faculty who can't actually read music in some of the post-1992 universities, and popular music is the thing, and it's a growing thing. I'm not saying that's necessarily always a bad thing, but I find it utterly false to say it's all Western art music.
The discipline of musicology is Western classical music. You're rejecting that.
Sorry? I'm rejecting the idea that it's all like that, yes. I think there's a lot more. It depends on the place. It depends on the place. I wouldn't say that's the case here. I'm not even sure it's the case in places like King's or Holloway any longer.
In the RMA?
In the RMA. Well, it's a conference. I'm talking about actually in departments. It's an association.
Well, the point about musicology without ears, again, I think, doesn't really shine at all with what ethnomusicologists do. And I think also the idea that, you know, the kinds of listening that you're encouraging, the study of Western classical music are applicable. And the idea that, say, you know, the skills, the sort of implicit dismissal of the skills of listening to other kinds of music that then accomplish what you say.
Now, you're attributing positions to me that I'm not taking. When I talk about musicology with ideas, it's music which musicology which doesn't involve listening at all, whatever the music is. And there are many different approaches to listening, many appropriate ones with different types of music, but the stuff that takes the sounds out altogether, that's what I would refer to. And please note that the whole critique is focused on this specific body of work. I'm not talking about all ethnomusicology. No one's in a position to make a judgment on that, unless they sort of read about sort of 30 languages and read everything that have been done. I'm talking about this specific body of work that is ethnomusicology that looks at Western art music.
Because then you have this focus on metal and so on. Actually, lots of the critiques that you're making of ethnomusicology sort of rather dated ethnomusicology that's been critiqued within the discipline quite effectively, and in exactly the same terms that you do something. And I also would like to pick up on this term politically loaded, which you mentioned is a politically loaded point. I mean, I would say that there is the focus, there's something very politically loaded about most people within ethnomusicology studying Western classical music. I think that's deeply politically loaded.
I don't believe there's anything that's somehow completely free of politics, but you know, to characterise. No.
Critiquing ethnomusicology being politically loaded, then to some sort of non-politically loaded area that you're somehow.
If I'm talking about a chromatic progression from the 5th to the 6th degree of the scale, I think that's rather less politically loaded language than if I say this is a language of Western imperialism against the Muslim world, which it has been characterised. Sorry?
It's more explicitly.
Well, I would have thought that stuff about imperialism is pretty explicit. That's. You mean using language drawn. Yeah.
Sort of political and class position often underneath the language, technical language of analysis.
But isn't part of what Andrew's saying that your very statement that you're critiquing that work for being politically loaded is in itself politically loaded?
Nothing is outside of politics. I don't think so. But if I can give you an example which I didn't get a chance to say, which probably exemplifies as well. In a case of a French musicologist, Anne Boissier, critiqued Cook's music, a very short introduction. She said he thought the approach was nihilistic because he didn't want to deny the whole possibility that music could serve a critical function in a society. Now, his response was to accuse her of being, and I'm quoting here, part of the attack on capitalism and consumerism that developed throughout the German-speaking worlds in the 19th century, where it was associated with the nostalgic views of an idealized rural past, and fed ultimately into the Nazi creed of blood and soil. This old tactic that if you don't like your European colleagues, you try and make them out to be Nazis, not one of the most edifying parts of our profession, in my view. Now, I would say that is really politically loaded.
Yes, politically loaded because the discipline that's focusing on this is allegedly politically loaded.
Yeah, but to call someone else being akin to a Nazi is on a wholly different level. You're equating them with people who committed genocide. That is much more politically loaded than. I don't think you can get much more politically loaded than basically implying that someone, because they think a certain way, is not far from being a Nazi.
Perhaps go to another question, please. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the panel to define ethnomusicology, which is something I haven't really heard. I've heard certain aspects of it. I've heard ethnomusicologists cited, such as what we know, Ruth Finnegan, Stephanie Fitz, others like Georgie DeBoer, who many of us wouldn't consider ethnomusicologists. I've heard the idea that ethnomusicologists don't deal with history because it's dead. There's many ethnomusicologists who do, of course. and ethnomusicology seems to be a broad thing, a broad church. I recognise that many ethnomusicologists need some sort of theory and methodology, and that this may be problematic for defining the field. But where do we go in saying that we're ethnomusicologists? Is the characterisation of ethnomusicology something related to anthropology, potentially sociology, which relates into ethnography, or is that just a marriage of convenience, as someone like Fred Lieberman would have had it? In the American case, we're very aware that most ethnomusicology hasn't situated itself in anthropology provenance, despite Merriam's best efforts. We're in musicology provenance in America and Britain, primarily. So how would you want to define this field called ethnomusicology? Or is it even possible to define it?
Well, I think I pointed to some of the problems of trying to define it, and I'm not sure. I think it's very difficult to pin down something that we all do, because not everyone does ethnography, some of us do history. It is more about those kinds of affiliations and scholarly heritages, I think, that pull us together. And, you know, you go, the most recent Buffy conference, there's almost nothing now that isn't there being talked about in some way, I think. I mean, I think one of the problems, it's not really a problem, one of the issues is that we were defined by default as covering the things that folklore studies and musicology didn't. So we sort of evolved in that way, I guess, and covered a whole range of different areas. I mean, there are, I don't know if obviously I'll let the other panel members answer, but there are many people in the audience who could probably contribute to this as well, Keith. Sorry.
We have an ongoing discussion among ethnomusicologists in Denmark whether we are, in fact, ethnomusicologists or musical anthropologists, which we tend to think or believe, some of us, distancing ourselves from those who still collect as in the old days. And they talk about going into the field and making a collection, which I, for many reasons, dislike that way of approaching people's music as some piece of a sediment in the layer in the ground or something. But still, the old goblin, it's a Danish phrase, I don't know if it works in English, the goblin moves along when we change the name from ethno to anthropo something. So we are still reading ethnomusicology or the Ethnomusicology Forum or other journals that has the ethno prefix all over it, which for many reasons is a bit problematic, I believe. But that's just one of the points that in your question, and I think that anthropologists in Denmark they wouldn't say that we are really anthropologists because we're musicologists. We just read some anthropology, and we really study music. So I don't know where I'm going with this.
Well, it's sort of a question, yeah. I think it's entirely with both of you, but is there a crisis in ethnomusicology as to what it is?
I don't think there is. I think we've gone, well, I don't know, maybe younger scholars coming up. We've spent a long time debating this, and I think a lot of us have just, it doesn't really matter anymore. I mean, we get on studying the music, and we draw on ideas from wherever they might be useful, and we use different approaches. For me, it doesn't really matter. I call myself, for many years I was all for ditching the ethno and probably the ology as well, because I don't think either of them serve us particularly well. But we don't have any alternative, and we kind of know what it is, even if we can't articulate it. That's my view, anyway.
And your book was published in the SOAS Musicology series.
Well, yes, but I think of it as ethnomusicology. But Alex just thought of it as Iranian studies, so there we go.
Can I say one quick thought on that? I mean, because I certainly don't have any particular wish to separate what traditionally have been known as ethnomusicology and musicology, and I recognise absolutely what you're saying, that some of those people wouldn't be seen as that I mentioned wouldn't be seen as ethnomusicologists, though they are regularly cited as part of a tradition, within this tradition, I say. But you say we get on studying the music. Yes, when we are actually doing that. I spent a lot of time reading some work by historians on music in 20th century Germany, some fantastic work by people like Toby Thacker or David Monod and so on. Now, it's very clear to me that they are historians, they're not musicologists, and when it comes to sort of characterising broad things in music, that's where they get a bit unstuck. Or same with Michael Cater in his work on the music of the Third Reich. Now, I allow that, well, not allow that, but I mean, that's to be expected, just like I doubt many musicologists will ever quite manage the level of historical detail and nuance of methodology that fully trained historians would. But I think if we just completely collapse disciplinary boundaries, then we end up with, with other forms of hierarchy to do with which have the greater institutional power. And I think that can be ominous for the future of music study as a whole.
Can I just say one thing in response to Keith's question? I think it is important to remember that the national ethnomusicologies vary a great deal as well. So what ethnomusicology means in China will be very different from what it means in the United States, for example. So we've not, it's ethnomusicologies, if you like, rather than just the singular as well. So add that to the problem.
There was a comment.
So, Ryan.
Hi, if we were, this is a bit of an idealist thing, but if we were to do away with institutional frameworks and disciplinary straitjackets, just for the moment, as a student who's coming to this study very fresh, I can tell you coming in, there is definite divides between the different, how it is presented to me as a student. I thought, I either have to be an ethno or a historian, whereas from the start I've kept saying, no, I don't have to be any of you, I can be all of you. So for example, when Ian, you very rightly, I agree with you, some ethnomusicology stuff can really go on and forget the music. Equally, within musicology, music can forget the people and the society. So it becomes text-driven without context, and at the other end of the spectrum, it becomes context without text. One of the best ways for me to get over this problem that I've come across when I'm trying to think of theories and methods is to simply think of all of these different, as Laudan says, all of these different, be it music, popular music, history of music, whatever all these subdisciplines are, for me are simply methods, tools, and theories that I will extract as applicable to my study. I don't have to be any of them, and I think that might be, when you were saying one way to go forward, it does mean that each discipline has to establish what theories and methodological backgrounds it's got, but then it leaves me, the student, to decide if I need a bit of popular music studies, I'll use it. If I need a bit of musicology, I'll use it. Why shouldn't I?
Sure. Well, sorry.
I was just going to say, actually, I think that's a very interesting point, because I found myself doing precisely that in the article I mentioned back in 2011, using ethnomusicological tools and methods because they helped me find some new ways of talking about collaborations and creative processes. And it wasn't really until Laudan asked me to contribute to that special issue of the journal that I thought that what I was suddenly thinking about, am I an ethnomusicologist for doing that? And so that's, I think that's an interesting point.
Culture, which really then goes back to ontology and how each person is trying to protect their corner. But I'm saying in an ideal world where we didn't have this, get a job and get this grant under this name. Because I've heard people talk about, I submitted this under sound studies, because sound studies is the big word now. So clearly, the academic framework and funding does create a problem. But if that wasn't to be there, I think it would be a far healthier way to just look at it without these other external issues.
Okay, I can't really imagine a world where some such frameworks do not exist, though. So, I mean, yeah, it is a nice idea. Or say if we're devising a degree program where we could just offer absolutely everything anyone might want to take, even if no one enrolls for it, we can keep it going. But we have financial realities to deal with, so we have to make some choices.
In archaeology, because I'm really beginning to think musicology could do with some archaeological approaches, we are taught about, no, I'm being deadly serious today, because they go all the way from the scientific to the thoroughly phenomenological. And when you first enter as an undergrad, they simply teach you all the different tools and techniques under the different subdisciplines. You don't become a zoo archaeologist, but you're aware of what the zoo archaeologist does. You don't have to. I don't have to be a musicologist to be aware and using your tools and techniques.
But music is such an incredibly broad field. I don't think there'd ever be time to do everything like that way. When we try to be broad.
But if you work together, this was it. If, for example, a text was to be taken by a musicologist, treated as a text, all the things about Tom, la 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 la. If someone from why couldn't there be more collaborative research? That's the other question. This is all stopping it.
Actually, if I might, in all fairness, I mean that in terms of exposing undergraduates, that's precisely what we try to do at working with my colleagues here in terms of the curricular revisions that we're making right now to the undergraduate program here. So I think that actually we draw on each other's strengths and try to complement them and try to open up worlds for undergraduates. So I think that's true. And also in archaeology, there have been also some reflective turns of sort very recently. I mean, there are similar things to what have happened in ethnomusicology. I'm thinking of the work of for example, Yannis Kamilakis on looking at contextualizing historically what has happened in the world of archaeology, where it's very politically loaded, and I had a number of colleagues at Princeton when I was there last who were working on that in the field of Hellenic studies. So I don't think it's actually all that different as a field. Sorry, but to then hand it over to the panel. Any other comments? Please.
I had a question. So, kind of in light of what you were saying about the disciplined and skilled sort of, I think the example was when people can talk about Schubert and everyone's familiar with it. To me, that sounds quite like the Paulo Freire description of the Western banking method of information and education. And in light of the way the world's gone, things like take news for an example, like if you take journalism 2.0, like for example, these are not people who are citizen journalism, they're not trained in classical camera techniques and they're not trained in classical grammar. But if we were to disregard that, we would miss the breadth of all this other experience that's coming from a hip-hop studies background, where I've heard people from a musicology background relegate things like the turntablism to like sort of an emulation of something. It just shows such a big misunderstanding. Do you think that this disciplined and skilled version of musicology is even equipped to deal with where we are at now and music and society? Is it even equipped to deal with it? Can it speak on it?
The Schubert example wasn't mine. I can't remember who. It's me.
I think it does. I think that musicology conferences have, exponentially exploded and are ahead of these.
If you think of the examples of, like, say, for example, in hip hop or like reggae, where there's like dub plate culture, where different songs are recorded on the same instrumental backing, so sonically there is not that much of a differentiation. And say, like, for example, in reggae dub plate, you get 7 or 8 different artists, but each one of these songs that is a massive difference. And in musicological skilled analytical terms, it feels like, do they have the right tools to even analyze these phenomena?
Not yet. But one difference is between dead composers like Debussy and living music. And that's a bit like ethnography, which does deal with history, but people who are alive. This is oral history, where respondents are there to recall memories and cultural heritage. So you have this sort of analogy, on the one hand, between living respondents and dead history, and I suppose historically dead composers, and contemporary music which is happening all around us. So that is I think it's an interesting difference. And although I said I sense that there's a disrespect for abstraction, there's also a disrespect for history. For history which, it's several thousand years, which will not go away.
So what if we reach the point where the contribution canonically has been made, and like Roy was saying, we can draw on these examples, but to stick to that, the skilled discipline, it just, to me, it seems to relegate it to this sort of very zealous school of thought that kind of disregards it. It would be the equivalent of a news channel saying, no, we're only using stuff by our journalists who've gone out there with the right training, with the right cameras, so there's a consensus on what film is used, on what lighting is used, and it does not meet these conditions.
I think if you
wouldn't have the grainy handheld footage of the 9/11 towers going up, for example.
I think if you go to a musicology conference anywhere in the world, there is a health effect and a balanced respect for historical canons. And there is a funny disdain for the word canonicity, actually, and canons are important. And on the other hand, an equal space for living music. It's not prejudicial to either side. One can imagine there might be, but the reality is not the case.
It feels like it relegates it to a presumed superiority.
I don't think. No, I don't think.
In my experience of going to places.
I don't think so. And the fact is, the majority of music is historical, and we can be custodians of that, or we can forget about it.
When I teach popular music, as I do to first years in a history course, that goes back at least till the 1840s or so. That's the historical phenomenon, and that's only just looking at it in the West, just because the remit is for Western music there. Being historical, being skilled, are not by any means necessarily linked to a privileging of a Western classical tradition.
Another way to perhaps to formulate an answer to what I hear you saying is the beauty of developing ethnomusicology, or some mix of ethnomusicology with a historical sense of what is going on in the music you are talking about, and combining these with studies of the particular region you're talking about, studies on sound, sampling, a range of various approaches you would need to do that study yourself that you are calling for, or perhaps you are calling for it. I don't know, because those scholars, they are out there somewhere, but you could point to many different traditions and particular musics, and they would not have been studied the way you could have imagined. So you could project those ideas that you have and make your own path towards the right study you're talking about.
Under that framework, it just seems like, for example, hip-hop studies, that's the area that I'm concerned with myself. It's just relegated to the poetry and the composition of the music.
Yeah, sure.
And it just cuts out so much more.
Hip-hop is a big area. A lot of hip-hop scholars.
There's a compulsory course on hip-hop in the first year at Oxford nowadays.
Oh my.
Yeah, I know. But I'm saying, from your position, it kind of relegates a lot of these courses. They deal with stuff like rap as poetry, or the compositional aspect of the music that's produced. For example, you mentioned sampling. Like, the sampling, the way that it's talked about, the way that it's mentioned by classical musicology, it shows a misunderstanding from within the practice.
Agreed, and that's actually part of what I'm critiquing about de-skilling, though, because it's when some of that work is done primarily by sociologists who are not, on the whole, au fait with ways of dealing with those sort of musical specifics, or dealing with poetry, and so it turns into all a sort of subset of sociology. Now, not to say that isn't a very valid approach to hip-hop, but I think if that becomes the only approach, and not one that actually looks more at the music, looks at the lyrics, I think that's a great loss.
Perhaps one more question, if we have one. I think we've got time for one more. Please.
Maybe a question, or maybe it's a comment. I can tell from I'll layer it on my accent, but I've just recently moved back to the UK from Australia, and we mentioned the RMA's come up a couple of times, and I must say having gone to the last year's this year's RMA conference, I was immediately struck by how organised the RMA feels. Now, one of the consequences of that is some of the sort of assumptions that are being made in the third setting couldn't possibly be made in Australia, because there's one musicological society in Australia, the MSA, where pretty much everyone goes to, whether it's popular studies, ethnomusicology. And I'm afraid there's no doubt there that what you're seeing or what you're witnessing over the last 10 years is the death of scholarship, and I dare I say, in a political economy sense, the death of jobs in areas like music analysis, Western music history, and so on and so forth, which I throw out there with, I think it'd be very interesting how we judge that, but it's undeniable. Whereas it seems to be much more healthy, and maybe I can put this closer to as a challenge for the UK music academic field, that we actually stop meeting in little groups, and actually it would be much more healthy if we actually got a sense of the breadth of disciplinary activity, precisely so that we can do what we're doing tonight. And kind of perhaps say that's more as a comment that I wish there were more conversation about this. I know there's been, some many people have very impassioned views on some of this, but congratulations on City University for putting this on, because I think this is precisely the conversation that I know it's very, it's narcissistic of the discipline, but it's a kind of conversation that we do need to have. Perhaps even, dare I say, it would be good to have an ethnography of the changes in tertiary music education. That would be very interesting thing to look at.
Thank you. Any?
I'd like to just make a point on that regarding the conferences I'm about to hold at Bath University, because the topic of the conference is performance studies. It's a performance studies network, and that welcomes and has a very rich program of people from all the sort of disciplines, so it's cross-genre as well, and cross-disciplinary.
And I think, yes, just following on from that, I think that's where these meeting points happen, actually. So I've been to several conferences recently where there was the Hidden Musicians Revisited conference in January that brought together musicologists, ethnomusicologists, popular music, people from outside musicology, strictly speaking. So rather than the society conferences necessarily, I think those other conferences are where you're getting, the Hip Hop Studies Conference, which is going to be in June in Cambridge, there's a wide range of people coming to that conference. So those seem to be the places where these kinds of conversations are maybe happening. And I agree with you, there should be more conversations happening between RMA and Buffy and the musical analysis people, popular music studies, and those conversations have happened on and off over the years. And there was a time in the late mid 1990s onwards where there were several, I think 3 conferences in a row when all the musicological societies came together and had joint conferences, and then they fizzled out, and I don't know why. They could probably do with reviving again. So yes, you're right in a way, but I think these things are happening perhaps in other fora.
In line with this, I could add that in metal music studies, a new and vast growing field, look out. This is popular music scholars, ethnomusicologists, sociologists, cognitive scientists,
Musicologists?
Musicologists. You name it, getting together talking about metal. So and there you have this conversation over various boundaries and a lot of heated debate of what the object really is in the brain or in the culture or in the language or in the body. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. In Bournemouth next week, metal and politics.
I can report 2 opposite or reciprocal phenomena. On the one hand, I ran a themed conference on music and emotion, which attracted a whole range of disciplines right across from neuroscience to ethnomusicology and history. There is a plethora of themed conferences across the world, but on the other hand, I'm also closely involved with Analysis Conference, and the rubric Analysis, perhaps comparably to the rubric Ethnomusicology, ends up being a shell company, an empty relic of a time when we knew what analysis meant, when we could define it 30 years ago. Now it's a lot harder. That being said, the rubric survives as a very useful shell company, a big tent in which lots of very different people can come together and speak. And the artificiality of that rubric serves an interesting purpose.
Can I just
just slightly going back to Roya's comment, I mean, absolutely all these things that have been said, I wholeheartedly think they're a good thing. What ultimately we can't get away from, and this is an issue with most, I think, rhetoric about diversity, is that resources are always going to be finite. Time is always finite. And as I say, I can't imagine a musical world where there will not be some competing interests. And the more things diversify, the more potential there is for that. And I think one of the reasons that we do have a debate like this is because ultimately there are times where, like at another university in London, that one half of the faculty wants to have a longer music history thing, and another half of it wants to cut that by half and replace that with something that they would associate with ethnomusicology. And you couldn't have all three because there isn't the time in the core curriculum for that. And I would be surprised if there are many departments where there haven't been those sorts of conversations. So thinking that it's great if we can just have lots more of everything and lots more diversity and all there and everything will be wonderful is great as an ideal, absolutely. But I think especially with sort of cuts to funding and declining numbers coming to study music in higher education, which is a very real issue in many places. This is why perhaps some of these sort of debates over territory are inevitable.
Well, I think we've ended up back with our zero-sum versus positive-sum dichotomy there. But thank you to all of the panel members for coming from near and far, and for Ian for suggesting this panel, and for the Department of Music here at City for hosting this as part of its 40th anniversary celebrations, and for all of you for coming this evening. Thank you all.